Brad Williams, XL Prime. Section 13.12, how to get the average of all numbers that meet a certain criteria. We've already talked briefly about sum if and count if. We can also use an average if. And why do we want to use an average if? Well, there's certain criteria that can throw your calculations into chaos if you're averaging. Let me give you an example. And if I haven't talked about average, well, here's a quick introduction. Average is just arithmetic means of the range of information you're trying to get. So basically, it's just the average. When you say mean in terms of math, that means just the average. Looking at the average here as an example, what we're doing here is just taking the average of some test scores. Here we have in C7 through E7, we have 71, 72, 71, and 0. We have an average of 47.67. If you're keeping score of tests, that's accurate. But what if you have a range? You use 0 as a filler. What happens if you average that information? See the criteria we run into with just the average example? We're kind of locked in here. What if we can average and exclude the 0? That's where the average if comes into play. The average if has a range, it has a criteria, 2 arguments we've discussed previous, but it also adds an optional range. Let's take an example. Let's use the example just below the average. We're using the average if. Here's the range as highlighted in blue. There's the criteria. We want to average everything but zeros. And look at the difference. If we're looking at the exact same range as the previous example, excluding 0, the average is 71.5. And that's dramatic. If you're averaging a range that is filled with zeros, perfect example is if this number here is an error for whatever reason, and you put if error, and then you recognize the 0, you average this information without blocking out the 0, you can see how it can skew your answer. So using the average if will allow us to override that. Another example, we're using Steve. We want to know Steve's score. It's just the average because there's no zeros here. If we look at the second example with Mark's score, it's the exact same thing as we showed earlier. What if we have multiple conditions? Well, we'll explain that next. Brad Williams, XL Prime.